For $100, Fortune Carter purchased a deserted settlement. However, as he got to what should have been nothing but decaying ruins, he saw smoke rising from a chimney that should have been defunct. Where only weeds should have been, a garden was flourishing. Through a fractured window, he noticed a shadow flicker across a room that ought to have been empty for decades. The document inside his coat established that he was the owner of every structure, every piece of ground, and every shattered aspiration that had once made this place a home. However, the woman in the general store doorway, grasping a rifle with her calloused hands, implied that his ownership might not be recognized by everybody. Fortune got off his horse, and a cloud of dust rose around his scuffed boots as he took in what he thought he now owned. The morning light created very long shadows that stretched in between each building, and he could make out noises that he really did not think would be there in a ghost town. Voices, seemingly a child's cough emerging from inside one of the buildings. Moving slowly, he made his way toward the store, keeping his hands where she could see them. The woman at the entrance did not put down the rifle, and her gaze showed a kind of exhaustion that came from defending something incredibly valuable against impossible odds. "Ma'am," Fortune began, stopping a good distance away, "there seems to be some kind of misunderstanding." "There's no confusion here," Elowen Silvermoor answered, her tone firm despite the trembling of her hands. "You're the outsider here." Behind her, framed in the open doorway, Fortune was able to see a hastily arranged living space. Blankets were used as room dividers. Cans of food were stacked on precarious shelves. A little fire burned in the space that at one time had been a shopkeeper's display. It was clear that this wasn't just a campground. This was a home. Fortune tapped his coat pocket and said, "I have the deed. I bought this town from the county. It was all legal and above board." Elowen gave a sharp laugh. "Legal and above board. That's what they kept saying as they seized my husband's farm. Legal and above board when they repossessed our house. Legal and above board when they left us with no place to turn except here." A harsh, wet cough came from further back in the building. For a brief moment, Elowen's tough exterior vanished. Her eyes flashed toward the sound before she regained focus on Fortune. "That's my granddaughter," she explained. "She's ill, and this is the only cover we can find for 100 miles in any direction." Fortune's heart sank. He had come expecting to explore deserted buildings, perhaps tidy them up, and determine what sort of business might succeed in this remote corner of the territory. He never thought he'd find people. He certainly did not think he was going to find a family barely scraping by in the bones of someone else's failure. "How long have you been settled here?" he inquired. 3 months, Elowen answered, "since the bank took everything else we had." From somewhere within, the coughing grew worse, and Elowen tightened her hold around the rifle, no longer aiming it at him, but on alert. Always ready. "She needs medicine," Elowen stated in a low voice, "and some peace, along with a roof that doesn't leak whenever it's raining." Fortune glanced around at the buildings he was now the legal owner of. Some had roofs that had caved in. Others possessed walls that seemed unlikely to withstand much wind. Yet within the confines of what was once the town's general store, someone had managed to build a space that felt relatively secure. However, the law was absolute, and the deed he carried made it clear. He was the owner of this land, these structures, everything that Elowen and her granddaughter depended on for survival. The question was, what was he going to do about it? From inside the store they heard something fall, followed by a faint plea for assistance. Elowen's rifle crashed to the floor as she hurried inside. Fortune found he was following her, stepping into a world that seemed impossible in his abandoned town. He saw the general store's interior transformed into a space that was both a home and a rudimentary medical facility. Wooden crates acted as tables and chairs. Pieces of fabric were suspended from the ceiling, forming different areas for privacy. And in the corner, on a bed cobbled together from blankets and planks, was the frailest child Fortune had ever seen. Zephyrine Silvermoor couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. Her skin was as pale as a winter frost, and when she coughed, her small body trembled. Dark circles underscored her eyes, and she drew breath in short, shallow rasps. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. The water bucket had overturned and spilled. Elowen got down next to her granddaughter, placing a calloused hand on the girl's brow. The tenderness he saw was more piercing than a rifle pointed to his chest. "Her fever has worsened," Elowen muttered, seeming to speak more to herself. She looked up at Fortune, and in her gaze he saw something that tightened his gut. Desperation. "She must see a doctor," Elowen stated. "She needs proper care, not just the natural remedies I've been gathering." Fortune examined their makeshift dwelling. Water stains marked the walls due to leaks in the decaying roof. The floor was uneven with loose boards that posed the risk of a fall in the dark. The place was barely standing, and winter was approaching. "The closest physician is in Millfield," Fortune stated. "That's at least a 2-day journey." "I'm aware of its location," Elowen retorted. "Do you believe I haven't considered it? Do you think I haven't explored every possible course of action?" She rose to her feet, her hands forming fists. "We previously had funds. We possessed a wagon, horses, all that we required, but the bank seized everything. They claimed my husband failed to repay a debt he had never agreed to." Zephyrine began to cough again, and Elowen was immediately at her side, helping her to sit up so she could clear her lungs. The cough was deep and harsh, indicative of something perilous taking hold. "How much do you want?" Elowen asked abruptly, her voice tight. "For us to remain until spring, I'm able to work. I can cook, clean, mend apparel, tend livestock, whatever requirements you have." Fortune felt the deed in his pocket, heavy as a rock. He was the owner of this place. Every damaged plank, every leaky roof, every inch of the land these people considered home, the law allowed him to order them to leave. Yet, gazing at Zephyrine's feverish face and Elowen's desperate eyes, the law felt like a cold, sharp object he didn't want to handle. "I don't need workers," he stated cautiously. Elowen's face fell, believing he was refusing them. She thought he was about to cast them out into the desert, with nothing but their clothes and a sick child who might not survive the journey. But before she could react, before Fortune could clarify his true intentions, the sound of approaching horses echoed. Several horses, moving swiftly. Elowen stiffened, her eyes widening with a fear deeper than anything Fortune had witnessed. "They found us," she whispered. 3 men rode into the ghost town as if they owned it, which, until an hour ago, they likely believed they did. Their leader was a thin man with cold eyes and a badge that reflected the morning light. Behind him rode 2 deputies, both wearing expressions that suggested they relished their work. Sheriff Ravenwind dismounted outside the general store, his gaze shifting from Fortune to the smoke rising from the chimney to the garden plot, which definitely hadn't been there during his last visit. "Well, well," Ravenwind said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd found exactly what he sought. "Elowen Silvermoor, you've led us quite a chase." Elowen stood protectively in front of the doorway, blocking the sheriff's view of Zephyrine inside. We're not trespassing, Valerian. That's Sheriff Ravenwind to you, he replied, his attention now on Fortune. And you'd be the fool who bought this worthless pile of rocks from the county. Fortune felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. There was a history here, the kind that left scars and bred a hatred that never faded. I have legal ownership, Fortune said carefully. The deed is clear. Ravenwind laughed, devoid of humor. Legal ownership? That's rich. Tell me, friend, did the county mention they sold you land with outstanding debts attached? Mrs. Silvermoor here owes a considerable sum in unpaid loans and penalties. Elowen's face turned white. Those loans were forgeries. My husband never signed anything. Your dead husband can't testify to that, Ravenwind said, but his signature is on file at the bank, along with the accumulated interest and late fees. Comes to about $800 now. 800 Bah. Fortune felt the number hit him like a physical blow. That was more money than most people saw in Brayuac's years, more than Elowen could possibly have, and certainly more than he'd paid for the entire town. She doesn't have Ichma's 800 Lstar, Fortune said. No, she doesn't, Ravenwind agreed, which is why she's coming with us. The bank has other ways of settling debts. A deputy came forward, his hand on his weapon. Ma'am, you must come with us peacefully. From within the store, Zephyrines' cough echoed, harsh and desperate. Elowen's hands trembled, yet she remained rooted in the doorway. My granddaughter is ill, Elowen pleaded. She cannot travel. You should have considered that before you neglected your duties, Ravenwind retorted. The child will come too. The bank always recoups its investments. Fortune felt a dark anger well up within him. He had witnessed enough frontier justice to understand the fate of those who couldn't repay their debts. Women, especially, and children unable to work often ended up in places that decent people didn't discuss. What kind of work are we talking about? Fortune asked, though he already suspected the answer. Ravenwind's smile was unpleasant. The kind that settles debts effectively. Elowen's composure finally shattered. Please, she whispered. She's just a child. She's sick. Can't you see she's sick? But Ravenwind was already gesturing for his deputies to advance. They approached the store with the practiced movements of men accustomed to dealing with desperate women and sick children. That's when Fortune made a life-altering decision. He stepped between the deputies and Elowen, his hand resting on his own gun. The lady said, "No," he stated. The silence grew taut. Sheriff Ravenwind's eyes narrowed as he assessed Fortune, taking in the worn leather of his gun belt, his steady posture, and the absence of fear in his gaze. You don't want to get involved in this, friend, Ravenwind said, his tone shifting. He sounded cautious, as if realizing he might be facing a dangerous adversary. Too late for that, Fortune replied. These people are on my land. That makes it my business. One of the deputies, a young man with anxious eyes, shifted uneasily. Sheriff, perhaps we should return another time. Shut up, Shadebrook, Ravenwind snapped, but his focus remained on Fortune. Do you have any idea what you're interfering with here? Enlighten me. Ravenwind spat into the dust. Mrs. Silvermoor's husband borrowed money from Millfield Bank, signed the papers, made promises, then had the poor judgment to die before repaying his debt. Now, the debt falls to his family. Convenient, Fortune remarked. Dead men can't dispute signatures. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Elowen remained frozen in the doorway, caught between hope and terror. Zephyrines' coughing had subsided, but Fortune could hear her labored breathing in the silence. Ravenwind took a step closer. You know what I think? I think you don't understand how things work around here. This territory has laws, and I enforce them. The bank has rights, and I protect them. Mrs. Silvermoor has debts, and I collect them. If those obligations were invented, that decision isn't yours to make. Ravenwind let his hand fall onto his firearm. Move aside now. Fortune stayed planted. Hand over the documents, huh? The loan paperwork and the signatures. If this debt is genuine, demonstrate it for a moment. Doubt flashed across Ravenwind's expression. It vanished, replaced by icy wrath. I owe you no proof. Then you have no right to seize them. The deputy, Shadebrook, retreated a nervous step. Sheriff, this is spiraling out of control. I ordered him to be silent. Ravenwind growled. He examined Fortune for a long time before reaching an internal resolution. You want the documents? Very well. We'll head to Millfield, summon the bank president here with all the paperwork you demand, though that forces us to wait until tomorrow. Elowen let out a faint sigh of relief. Yet Ravenwind was not done. Naturally, that also means I'll bring a federal marshal back with me. And when he catches you meddling with the collection of lawful debts, you'll end up in chains. Fortune sensed the snare tightening around them. Ravenwind was offering him an escape, a chance to walk away and let these folks confront their destiny alone. All he needed to do was step back and pretend he'd never witnessed a sick child or a desperate grandmother. Yet Zephyrine began coughing again, a raw, painful sound in the morning air. Fortune realized his decision had already been made when he first saw Elowen in the doorway, rifle in hand, terror in her eyes. Bring your marshal, Fortune declared. Bring the papers. Bring anyone you wish. Ravenwind grinned, but it was the grin of a predator who had finally trapped his prey. You have no clue what you've just caused. As the sheriff and his posse rode off, Elowen finally spoke. They'll return with enough men to take us all. When the dust from Ravenwind's exit finally settled, Elowen slumped against the doorframe, her strength completely drained. Fortune watched her hands tremble, the full weight of everything bearing down on her now that the immediate danger had passed. Why, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Why would you risk everything for strangers? Fortune lacked a satisfactory reply. Perhaps it was how tiny and fragile Zephyrine seemed in that makeshift bed. Perhaps it was the desperation flashing in Elowen's eyes when she offered to work for their shelter. Or maybe it was simply the countless years he'd watched powerful men crush those who couldn't fight back. Tell me about the loan, he said, avoiding her question. Elowen remained silent for so long that Fortune thought she would never answer. Then she gathered a fragment of the strength she had earlier shown. My husband Gareth never took money from anyone, she stated. He was proud and stubborn, she added, noting that debt was just another sort of chain. She paused, staring toward the horizon where Ravenwind and his men had vanished. But once he passed away, a sudden flood of papers appeared, each bearing his signature and claiming he owed the bank for land upgrades, equipment, and other purchases we never made. Did anyone ever witness him sign such documents? Never. I had taken care of all of our financial affairs. Since Gareth struggled with reading, I oversaw all of the paperwork. Elowen's tone grew sour, which made it all too easy when I was barred from disputing the debt. The bank insisted that a widow could not contest the legal obligations of her deceased husband. Fortune felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had observed this scheme repeatedly in other towns and territories. where banks and crooked officials colluded to confiscate land from families that lacked legal recourse. A feeble cry came from inside the shop. Grandma. Elowen hurried to Zephyrine side, and Fortune trailed behind. The child appeared even more deteriorated than before. Her skin was reddened with fever, and her breaths came shallow. When she attempted to sit up, she lacked the strength to do so unaided. "I'm thirsty," Zephyrine whispered. Elowen reached for a water pail, only to find it almost empty. "The well out back still works," she told Fortune. Occasionally, Fortune would grab the bucket and walk outside. The well was ancient. Its wooden frame was weathered and cracked, yet when he lowered the rope, it was hauled up with clear water. While working, his thoughts lingered on the $800 sum. To people like Elowen, that amount was a small fortune. Yet Fortune concealed more than that in his saddlebags. Money he had amassed over years of frugal living and profitable cattle sales. He could settle the debt. Problem solved. Still, something about that remedy felt off. If he paid, he would be conceding that the debt was legitimate. He would be rewarding the corruption and encouraging its continuation. And what fate would befall the next family the bank and its allies chose to target? When he returned with water, Elowen sat beside Zephyrine, gently running her hand through the child's hair. "She needs medicine," Elowen said without looking up. "She requires real medicine from a legitimate doctor, and she needs it quickly." Ravenwind mentioned that the closest physician was in Millfield, the same town that houses the bank, the same town where Ravenwind has friends. Elowen finally met his gaze. "If we go there, we'll never return." Fortune placed the bucket down and weighed their choices. They could flee, but Zephyrine was too ill to travel far. They could hide, yet Ravenwind already knew their location. They could fight, but that would mean shooting lawmen, even the corrupt ones, and that would invite more trouble than any of them could handle. "There might be another option," Fortune said slowly, "but it would require complete trust in me." Elowen examined his expression. "What sort of option?" Before Fortune could reply, a sound chilled his blood. Hooves thundered again, this time from a different direction. And this time there were many more of them, a great many. Through the window they saw riders riding in from the east. This is a compelling Western scene with strong tension and escalating stakes. You've effectively expanded the conflict from a personal vendetta to a systemic corruption story, which raises the dramatic weight considerably. What's working well? The reveal is well-paced. Isolde's entrance and explanation naturally expands our understanding of the conspiracy. Strong character dynamics. The contrast between Elowen, weary, running, and Isolde, angry, fighting, is vivid and immediate. Clear stakes. The sick child, the corrupt marshal, the witness in hiding, and the splitting of forces all create multiple pressure points. Authentic dialogue. The characters speak with purpose and urgency without over-explaining. Areas to consider. The tactical problem needs sharper definition. You mentioned Fortune sees flaws in splitting forces, but we don't get his alternative or deeper analysis. What specifically worries him? Numbers? Timing? The terrain? Fortune's role feels slightly passive here. He's observing and reacting. Does he have expertise, military, strategic, that would make him valuable in planning? Give him agency in the solution. The witness setup is convenient. A clerk with a conscience who conveniently sends word feels a bit easy. Could there be complications? Is he reliable? Does someone doubt him? Suggestion for the next beat. Have Fortune propose a third option that uses the town's geography or his specific skills, something that shows why he's the protagonist beyond just being the guy who bought the town. This would also be a good moment for him to commit fully to the fight rather than just being swept along. The momentum is strong. Keep pushing forward. If Ravenwind had found Celestial first, his only witness would vanish. If the federal marshal was truly corrupt, as Isolde claimed, evidence might be irrelevant. There's another difficulty, Fortune stated. Even if we demonstrate the debts are fabricated, what prevents them from simply destroying this place and alleging we resisted arrest? Isolde's expression was grim. Nothing. That's why we are not just collecting evidence. We are gathering witnesses. Many of them. She pointed toward the distance, and Fortune saw more dust clouds on the horizon, more riders approaching from various directions. News of what's happening here is spreading, Isolde continued. Reporters from 3 different towns are riding this way. Investigators from the territorial capital are also coming. Even some tribal leaders from the reservation are arriving to see what all the commotion is about. Elowen looked at the approaching dust clouds. You're turning this into a spectacle. We're turning this into a public event, Isolde corrected. Something too extensive and too noticeable for Ravenwind and his associates to conceal. From inside the store, Zephyrines' coughing worsened, followed by a weak plea for help. Elowen hurried inside, and Fortune followed. The child was sitting up, but her face was flushed with fever, and her eyes were unfocused. Something is wrong, Elowen whispered. This feels different. Worse. Fortune knelt beside the makeshift bed and understood what Elowen meant. Zephyrines' breathing became more labored, and when she coughed, there were flecks of blood on her lips. We need that doctor, Elowen said, her voice trembling. We need him immediately. But as if summoned by their desperation, they heard a new sound from outside. A single horse approaching at full speed, its rider urging it onward. Through the window, Fortune saw Sheriff Ravenwind returning alone, riding as if driven by some unseen force. And when Ravenwind dismounted, Fortune noticed something in the man's face that hadn't been there before. Fear. Ravenwind's horse was covered in sweat, and the man himself looked as though he had stared into his own grave. He dismounted with shaky hands, his eyes darting between the assembled families and the dust clouds on the horizon that promised even more arrivals. This has gone too far, Ravenwind said, his voice lacking its usual authority. Way too far. Isolde Riverford stepped forward, her hand resting on her gun. What happened to your federal marshal, Sheriff? Ravenwind's laugh was bitter and desperate. Field Marshal's dead, shot down on the road by Sylvan Celestial. The word struck Fortune like a physical blow. He felt Elowen stiffen beside him, while Isolde's face turned pale. If their only witness had killed a federal marshal, everything changed. Celestial would now be hunted as a murderer, and his testimony would be worthless. You're lying, Isolde stated, but uncertainty crept into her voice. Am I? Ravenwind pulled a blood-stained badge from his jacket. This is a gripping Western scene with multiple crises converging. A dying child, corrupt officials, missing evidence, and an approaching armed force. The tension is well built through layered conflicts. I notice you've shared what appears to be a creative writing piece or story excerpt. I'm here to help. Are you looking for feedback on the writing, pacing, or character development? Help continuing. The story from this cliffhanger. Editing assistance for clarity or style. Analysis of themes or narrative structure. The scene effectively uses the ticking clock of Zephyrines' illness against the external threat, and Ravenwind's potential redemption arc adds moral complexity. The detail about Celestial's disappearance with incriminating evidence creates interesting stakes beyond the immediate crisis. What would be most helpful for you? The hired guns of the banks rode into the desolate town, anticipating a scene of frightened families hiding among the ruins. Instead, they encountered 24 armed settlers, 3 journalists with cameras, and a territorial investigator who had been gathering evidence of corruption in the area for several months. The gunfight was quick and conclusive. When the dust settled, half of the bank's men were injured, while the others had surrendered, with their leader demanding to converse with the person in command. "That would be me," Fortune declared, stepping forward with his weapon still raised. Pike, the leader, a man marked by scars, spat blood into the dirt. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. The bank controls this entire territory." "Not any longer," a new voice interjected. The territorial investigator, a lean man named Fenrison, approached carrying a leather satchel filled with documents. Sylvan Celestial did not kill that marshal. He saved him. Field Marshal Eldenson is alive and recuperating in the tribal settlement, along with enough proof to put Millfield Bank out of business permanently. Ravenwind's face turned pale, but the badge, the blood, Celestial's blood, Fenrison clarified. The man took a bullet to protect the marshal from the true assassins. The same individuals who had been forging signatures and seizing land for years. The revelation struck hard. Ravenwind hadn't aimed to support a corrupt system. He had been a pawn, manipulated by forces that viewed him as expendable. Yet none of this registered with Elowen, who was still holding Zephyrines' unconscious body. The child's breathing had grown so weak that each intake could be her final one. "She needs help right now," Elowen pleaded urgently. Ravenwind glanced at the fading child, then at his horse, ultimately making a choice that would alter the course of his life. "I'll take her to the tribal doctor. I know the paths, and my horse is fit for the journey." "I'm coming with you," Elowen stated. "So am I," Fortune added. They constructed a travois from blankets and wooden poles, carefully securing Zephyrine for the challenging trek that lay ahead. As they were about to depart, Isolde approached, holding something in her hands. "This came with the investigator," she said, presenting Elowen with an official-looking document declaring that all forged debts were null. "You're free, Elowen. You're all free." The journey to the tribal settlement tested every bit of Ravenwind's skill as a horseman and tracker. They navigated narrow canyon passes, forded rushing streams, and climbed steep rocky slopes that would have defeated lesser men. But Ravenwind's expertise of the terrain proved accurate, and what should have taken a day was accomplished in just 6 hours. The tribal doctor, a wise elderly man named Joseph Silvermoor Horse, examined Zephyrine with gentle hands and understanding eyes. He utilized herbs and traditional remedies, as well as techniques he had learned from white doctors many years ago. "Pneumonia," he stated simply, "but not too late." Not yet. They remained in the native village for 3 days as Zephyrine struggled to survive. Elowen stayed constantly by her granddaughter's side, and Fortune ended up assisting with any tasks that arose. During that period, Ravenwind dedicated his hours to drafting a thorough confession of all the bank's illicit activities he was aware of. On day 4, Zephyrine regained consciousness, and requested a drink of water. 6 months afterward, the abandoned town was renamed New Haven. Fortune allocated portions of his property to the families wronged by the bank, retaining just enough land to operate a modest ranch for cattle and crops. Elowen managed the general store, now truly stocked with merchandise, and Zephyrine had become sturdy enough to assist in its everyday duties. After serving a sentence in the territorial jail, Ravenwind came back to serve as New Haven's sheriff, this time safeguarding the townsfolk rather than the elite. The Millfield Bank was dissolved, and its holdings were apportioned among the families it had exploited. While autumn brushed the surrounding hills with color, Fortune lingered in his garden, observing Zephyrine herding chickens as Elowen served patrons in the shop. He had purchased the deserted town for $100 and discovered a value that far exceeded its price. He had discovered a family. Occasionally, during the stillness between dusk and nightfall, he could sense the genuine spirits of the town. Not the wandering dead, but the hopeful aspirations of those who had finally secured a place to call home. If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.